Okay, hello. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. Uh, Before we start off, do you have any just like questions for us? And welcome to the AP.
Cheers, cheers. No, I don't necessarily have any questions, so let's continue.
All right. Does Canada have any words for Egypt regarding their stance on not interacting with a bi ambassador?
Oh. Now, as much as I want to be vocal, in my opinion, on behalf of Canada, I can't necessarily take a stance anymore because ever since I resigned from Prime Minister, I don't necessarily have the right to start speaking on behalf of my own country that, quite frankly, I don't even run anymore. But I can give you insight as a Canadian on the matter.
Yeah, that'd be
Basically,
lovely.
yeah, basically, as someone who's LGBT themselves, I don't mind if someone follows the laws of the group that they represent. At the end of the day, it's a role play. They're meant to be role playing the laws, the constitution, the military aspect, all of it. That's the purpose of role playing. However, I also understand the opposition to it. Not every role play has to be on point. And as much as Canada may be quite angry at that, they did do a kind response by saying, we'll have another ambassador, but due to the fact we can't follow it because it's in our constitution, we can't do that. It's Sharia law. They're respecting their own religion, which is quite admirable in that aspect. Because nowadays, in one society, people who follow their own religion's laws get criticised, discriminated, seen as very vile people. But it's not like that at all. But overall, I do think that in a case like this, it's a very, very hard topic to really delve into and get a really justified conclusion without fucking someone up. That's necessarily all I can really give on that.
All right, thank you. What is your stance as a Canadian citizen, just rephrasing that as per your earlier request, on the Antarctic situation?
In my opinion, Antarctica, as any other nation, has the right to sovereignty. And as much as I might be, Canadian, I've sworn loyalty to the king, all that shalom, I still understand where their opposition's coming from. But as someone who tried to ease tensions, negotiate at the NATO conference earlier this week, I don't necessarily see anything else I can do in that regard because they have really pushed the boundaries of what we can do to de-escalate the situation. On my personal perspective, when I offered to the BUK for the British Antarctic territory to be reclaimed, the opposition to that was, no, we will not leave. We're here and we're here to stay. Quoting from Antarctic themselves. Now, as much as I am opposed to being a neutral bloke, I can't help but have an opinion on this because it's quite personal in my regard. I do have a lot of respect for both countries, and when it's come to this, I can't help but lean towards the UK side. Now, regardless of how the situation was handled, the territory was never recognised by the UK because the UK has been suspended. And if we're going to follow UN resolutions, then technically Antarctica shouldn't even be here by the resolution I proposed a few weeks prior. I believe the Department of Legal Affairs will do something about that, but it's not necessarily up to me. But until that happens, then all I can necessarily say and guarantee is that the NATO isn't going to support Antarctica at this point in time. Without a real claim or bias to the situation that turns to neutral ground where we can actually agree on something, why should we get involved? It's necessarily their problem. Let it remain as theirs. And if I can bring an example into this, a few months ago, when NATO was run by OSEF USA, the first attempt at it, when it was necessarily just controlled by the UK, Finland, Norway, France, a few other countries, and the Pakistan situation with Australia. Now, as we all know, Australia back then was a member of NATO, and they did propose to NATO for support. However, due to the fact Australia was just being biased, the same context can be brought into this situation because NATO went ahead and said, no, It's too biased and it has nothing to do with us. So the war against Pakistan pretty much became a pissing contest for about an hour and a half in a conference meeting room, and that basically got resolved there. In all honesty, though, no situation can really be related to another. It all goes down to how handling of situations in diplomacy is held. And as someone who prides themselves on good diplomacy, it's pretty much a laughing stock, to be quite honest. You've got one side wanting to try and resolve the situation, and another that's just trying to lit the fire. That's all I can necessarily say.
All right. So, what are your thoughts on Al Qaeda's recent movements and them being removed from the UN?
In my perspective, Al Qaeda was a questionable organization, just like ISIS was. The idea and concept of terrorist organizations operating NATO on paper sounds like a wonder. It brings activity, it gets shit moving, it brings more of a justified reason for public services to actually do something, police, all of that. It gets a city active, it gets people on the feet, not really getting inactive in a community. But as seen, we all know, terrorist organizations in the UN unfortunately don't work unless done and moderated on point. For example, the situation with Kim Il Sung and Al Qaeda. Yes, I can consider that a failure, in my opinion. The organization was fine, it followed the rules until they realized they had Kim Il Sung hiding the organization and secretly leading it. And as much as I have a personal bad history with Kim, I do want to help uphold UN rules because it's not really fair for a country to get suspended for harboring him when an organization can do the same and not be given the same sort of reasoning. Now, I'm quite happy they've been suspended, but I am quite sad that there is no other terrorist organisation to help bolster activity in the areas and countries that need it most. Because, quite frankly, they were aiming for smaller nations like Pakistan, India, nations that necessarily didn't have activity above at least 5 people in game. No offence, Jenna. But if you can see the point I'm trying to get, it's not a bad idea, but the execution of ideas are a completely different story. And that's just honestly my opinion on the entire matter, to be quite honest.
Great, thank you. Can you comment on why you believe Canada joined NATO?
To be quite honest, the entire purposes of NATO when I was Prime Minister was to keep a sense of security in North America. Now, as much as I'm an advocate against the Commonwealth of Nations, NATO seemed to be a scapegoat for most people. Primarily because, Canada's had terrible relations with the Commonwealth. We've never really gotten along with them, and the times that we do, someone always comes along and ruin them. For example, the Secretary General Callum C. Tennant, he was an absolute clusterfuck, didn't last a week. It only took a Canadian Chief Justice and myself for him to rage quit from the group completely, showing how incompetent he is. But I'll get back to the question. Canada and the US have had an everlasting, strong relationship. Ever since I've been Governor General about 7 months ago, my time with them has proven that the Canadian and US relations cannot be broken unless really damaging situations occur. The idea of NATO nowadays, after an intense reorganisation with me and Dave, was to make it less political and more focused on military and economic support. Now, I do understand economics and diplomacy do intertwine a lot, so we have made some arrangements to ease that in, but not to the extent that C2SO might do. As much as NATO used to be a large-bodied organisation focused mainly in the North Atlantic, myself and Dave decided that it should be applicable to expand to Australia, to Pacific, all that shit. Now, overall, Canada and NATO are a perfect match, purely because the United States has the advantage in special forces training and the capabilities that might be needed for Canadian forces to operate efficiently. It's a mix and match of situations, to be quite honest. And it's like that in Canada all the time. We have agencies that originate from the UK moving over. We have agencies and military support coming from different countries. It's a diverse process, and it takes time to really manipulate into something worthwhile, which is why NATO was formed, to ease the process, to make it easier and more efficient for our commanders and military officers to get comfortable with allies before we make any major agreements on military cooperation and shit like that. So basically, all in all, Canada has only done this to really make things better for themselves, but also willing to cooperate internationally. Now, I say this as a Canadian citizen and as someone who helped forge the organisation's reforms when they were Prime Minister. I don't know the intentions of the current government, I don't know the intentions of what they do with the military, but I can say from the perspective of CANSOFCOM, which is my recent appointment, that I will be trying my hardest to ensure that Special Forces capability and anything to do with the military is enforced in NATO at all costs with Canada for the safety and procurement of our constitution, as anyone else would do for their own.
All right, thank you. We have one last question. Will Canada remain in NATO? Just like based on what you believe.
On the ideals that NATO used to be, and when I mean this, I mean NATO used to be a bit more on ground with the situation. Back then, it was a difficult time, the same scenario, more or less. We had different people in Canada at the same time. It was a difficult process to get around. For example, Katie, we all know the situation with her. She was Governor General, a very strong BUK advocate, wanted us to make our own organisation. It completely flopped in a week. The problem with that was because Canada and BUK have never had the sort of relationship that they would with the Russian Federation or with the United States. That being said, Canada will not probably leave NATO for any time soon, or at all, to be quite honest. After all, we did literally just waste about 4 to 3 weeks of reforming the organisation to be where it is today. And as much as I like to be very vocal about my opinions, I will say this. When it comes down to the truth, Canada and NATO are a perfect match. Like I said in my previous response to the question about Canada wanting to be in NATO and the relations with NATO and Canada, we have a very high tendency to get outside help where we need it most. Without NATO, that basically makes us lose a majority of the support we require in military aspects such as aerial, ground and naval support. Without NATO, we pretty much wouldn't have a secure baseline. Now, personally, to prevent that sort of situation ever coming to light, I will be trying to propose NORAD. It's a aerial defense organization with the United States. Sort of like NATO, but it's for space, sort of shit like that. Won't get into detail. But overall, Canada probably won't leave the NATO anytime soon. But at the end of the day, it's down to the Prime Minister and the current government. But they're very strong in the advocates that I left behind and the principles I'd followed during my time as Prime Minister. So I do have confidence that they will continue to support NATO wherever possible.
Lovely, thank you. Do you have anything that you would like to add on just to make anything clear, or?
Well, looking back, I believe that I didn't necessarily go into much of a borderline neutral opinion on Al-Qaeda. As Jinnah has spoken to me about, I did forget to mention that, although they did originate in Pakistan, the idea of bolstering activity, getting shit moving, I'll refer back to that. By what I mean is, a terrorist organisation. It's proposed it was done through AirTag's little idea. On paper, it seemed to just be a bolster of activity, get shit moving, have a lovely time in the process. It helps expand the military, the police force, even intelligence services to an extent. In Pakistan's situation, I can't say this without trying to offend them because I wasn't there, but this is an outside view. I believe Pakistan has and should have increased military support. Because as a result of this, I am quite sure Jinnah has posted a few images of the Pakistani armed forces doing some interesting CBQ. And as someone who appreciates Commonwealth nations and ex-Commonwealth nations, it's a good sign, because clearly the terrorist organisation worked. It did the job of getting the armed forces active. It made real provocations to Pakistan, sorry. But yeah, just general stuff like that can do a lot just for a community. And although the handling of Al Qaeda was a bit sloppy in some areas, I'm not going to ignore what has been done by the moderation team. That's pretty much all from me. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us.
Aye, of course.